Welcome back, econ students. How are you today? Okay, we are nearing the end of the term. I know some of you have already moved forward with the last few chapters, 16 and 17, where we talk about monopolistic competition and oligopolies. So these are pretty exciting. Hopefully you're enjoying the course. I know there's a few tricky things that, relating to graphing that maybe you haven't seen in other courses yet. So hopefully, and this is my first run with teaching this as an asynchronous, not having live back and forth synchronous with students. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but it's going, right? Okay, so a couple different things. So I would say rewatch that video, the Khan Academy video that talks about differentiation and talks about number of players, right? And so if you remember, or you watch that video and you take a peek at what is monopolistic competition, right? Monopolistic competition, the characteristics that make up that type of marketplace are very important. These are highly differentiated products, right? But we still have quite a few firms. The thing about this type of marketplace is that firms they don't have to settle for whatever price the market is because of differentiation in their products. And so this monopolistic competition is actually something called imperfect competition. And so we talked about the two extremes, perfect competition, which was many firms and identical products, and then we talked about monopoly, which is one firm. So if you go ahead and pull up the chapter 16 slides, if you want to scroll through those with me as I chat, you can pause the video and pull those up. Monopoly, so page 2, or the second slide, talks a little bit about those two extremes, and then talks about the other more in between items, which are these things called imperfect competition. So there we have the oligopoly, where we only have a few sellers and they offer similar products, or we have something called monopolistic competition, where we still have many sellers, but the products are differentiated. And so characteristics and examples of monopolistic competition: many sellers, right? You can enter in and out of it, easy entry and exit, and product differentiation. So this is where we have the highly differentiated products, branded items, cars. Like this is where you would see more like luxury brands, right? Like Lexus and let's see here, Lexus, Infinity, Mercedes. Not like super duper expensive, but like differentiated, right? They have different things about them that people choose versus choosing them over choosing cost as the number one item, because they actually have then, like regular cars, we shop on cost. What is the best deal you can get me? That is the most important thing. What is the best warranty I can get? So that would be more of a perfect competition. Regular, like cars broadly, right? Cars and trucks. And then when you talk about like fancy cars or luxury cars, they have they're differentiated in their item, in their value and in what they offer, but their price is different, right, from regular cars. All right, so some examples, and some of these examples are funny, but really when we're thinking about monopolistic competition, some bottled water, right? It's not free water. It's differentiated that it's Fiji and it comes from the Fiji Islands or something along those lines. Certain types of clothing are differentiated. And so we have more of a say in the price, right? So if you look at slide 4, things that I'm most concerned that number of sellers, entry and exit, what type of products do they sell, right? And does the firm have market power? In perfect competition, no. Everybody's a price taker. In monopolistic competition, you do have some power over what your price is and what you do in the marketplace. And the products are differentiated versus identical/similar. Many sellers in both, free entry and exit in both. Okay, and there are a few graphs here talking a little bit about this idea of in the short term anyway, what monopolistically competitive firm, how they earn profits, right? And so we talk a little bit about the demand curve. We've talked about that. We've talked about the marginal cost, marginal revenue, right? Incremental costs, incremental revenue, and where the two of those meet, which is then where that intersects with the average total cost. All of these are plotted from actual numbers, right? They're not just magically just come up with them on slide 6. And so they, much like in a perfectly competitive situation, the firm maximizes, even in a monopolistically competitive situation, maximizes profit when they produce a quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal costs, or where they intersect. Okay, so I'm not as concerned, about short run versus long run, but I do want you to look at. So one of the things though about monopolistic competition is that it's not quite the fair game that perfectly competitive marketplaces are, because there is somewhat of an imbalance of power, because the seller has more, they have market power where they didn't have it in perfectly competitive situations. And so policymakers or government officials, they're not sure sometimes how to control these types of markets if they need to, right? Because, and maybe they, the prices are, they're like gouging people. They want to buy these specific products with these differentiated qualities, then you're going to need to pay more money, right? And how is that then regulated? And so policymakers sometimes have a tricky time dealing with monopolistically competitive marketplaces. So there are a couple examples here, and then we talk about advertising. So in a monopolistically competitive industry, product differentiation and market pricing lead to the use of advertising, right? You have to tell the public why your product is so much better. That's why it costs more. And so the other thing is that economists in general, and as well as other people, advertising is always on the chopping block, because what does advertising do, right? And this chapter talks a little bit about that it manipulates our tastes, right? We waste resources. First of all, society wastes money in advertising, right? Second, it's there to manipulate people's tastes, make you feel like you need stuff you don't need, make you feel like you need other stuff maybe than the stuff that you have. It can kind of manipulate us, right? And we are living in a world of social media and algorithms and things telling us, well, you search for this, so you probably want this, kind of leading us down all these paths, right? Like the highest form or the most manipulative advertising you can basically get. It's like tailored to you. Anyway, is that good, right? Overall for society. Advertising then also impedes competition. It creates the perception that products are actually more differentiated than they really are, allowing for the prices to be higher. So if advertising is really slick, what will happen? Make us think that a product is actually better than another product when maybe it isn't. In defense of advertising, it informs, and now we are slide 12, it provides useful information for buyers, right? Advertising often tells us lists to us the things that are important or the things that are of quality of an item. This is why you should pay this price. This is why you should buy this item. Informed buyers can more easily find and exploit price differences. So if there's advertising on multiple products that are in a monopolistically competitive marketplace, you can compare them then if they all have really good advertising, right? And so in that sense, then it reduces market power and actually promotes competition among, we'll say, like among those fancy car dealers, right? Maybe you just want to buy a nice car, like a really nice car, and you're not sold on whether you want a Lexus or an Infiniti or a Audi or whatever it might be. So you shop those, right? So scroll through a few of these and see what you think and see how you feel about advertising, see how you feel about brand names, right? We usually spend more, firms with brand names usually spend more on advertising because they're able to charge higher prices than for products than generic, right? We all know this. Store brands versus brands that advertise regularly, they're more money, and they can charge more to cover those advertising costs. So thinking about brand names and how they come into play, and the critique of brand names. Sometimes we just buy them because we think they're better because they're a brand name, but they might not be. And we found this, right? And our willingness to pay, as we learned earlier, is maybe irrational. Well, we should buy, this one looks better, I'll pay more money for this shirt, when maybe it's the exact same shirt, we'll say. So conclusion, differentiated products are everywhere. Examples of monopolistic competition are everywhere. And it's one type of the four main, right, marketplaces. And again, in a perfect world, companies that were monopolistically competitive would be right there on the graph, all in a cluster, right? And they would all adhere to the characteristics that make up, and they would all play by the game rules that make up the monopolistically competitive marketplace. In reality, companies are in flux often. Maybe they are like a few circles away, like a ripple effect from the dot that is perfectly competitive, and they are actually more in a monopolistically competitive area. If you were to plot them on that X and Y axis of differentiation versus, and then many sellers. So maybe they are in the middle somewhere, right? So they kind of have to make up their rules, pull a few from both types of marketplaces. And so monopolistically competitive situation, just remember many sellers, highly differentiated products, and market power. All right, I'm going to jump in quickly to oligopoly, which is chapter 17. If you are following along with your slides, in the oligopoly situation, what we see is just a few players, right? And the concentration ratio. So slide 2, percentage of the market's total output is supplied by 4 of the largest firms. So typically like at 80%. So if 80% of the entire marketplace is supplied by 4 firms or less, it's considered an oligopoly. Now there is, this chapter will then focus on marketplaces that only have a few main players. So that's the idea of this chapter. There's some examples here of like tennis balls, credit cards. There's only a few main players, right? And then when it says concentration ratio, that means that, like credit cards, is 99%, right? 99% of the entire credit card marketplace is owned by 4 or less companies, right? Soft drinks, 93%, meaning 93% of the entire, if we think of a pie, of the entire pie is owned by 4 or less companies. They have captured that marketplace. So 7% of the soft drink marketplace is other outside of the 4 or 3 or 2, right? But it has to be 4 or less. No oligopoly market structure. They sell similar products often, right? And there's something in oligopoly that makes it different from monopolistically competitive and perfectly competitive. And in that situation, it is because there are a limited number of firms. So when you have a limited number of firms, it turns into a game. So game theory is how one of the ways that we look at, and one of the ways that players in an oligopoly can operate, right? And game theory tells us, or things they can use to operate, the study of how people behave in strategic situations. So game theory tells us basically, if one does this, what will this one do, right? So they're playing like a chess match, even if there's 4 of them, right? There's 4 in this chess match. They're playing a game against each other. And so the versus playing against buyers, right? And so there's a very specific type of oligopoly where there's only 2 players, and that's called a duopoly. And there's a couple examples here of what a monopoly situation would look like, and what, when it comes to costs and profit, right? On slide 6, and what a competitive situation would look like. The thing about a duopoly, for example, 2 firms, they could band together and basically act like a monopoly. And so we sometimes see this, and then that leaves buyers again in the dust, right? It's not a good thing for buyers. So one of the other things, and what that's called is collusion, an agreement among firms in a market about quantities to produce or prices to charge. So the example talks about collusion, then also mentions something called a cartel, where firms act in unison. And the issue with collusion versus self-interest is that both firms would be better off if they stick to their cartel agreement. But in a collusion situation, because whether there's 2 firms, 3 firms, or 4 firms, if the other firms say I'm one of the firms, shows their hand to me, okay, we're all going to do this. We're all going to use this price and this quantity. Agreed? So we all agree. That means now I know what the other 3 firms, exactly what their game plan is. I know exactly what they're going to do. So what can I do with that information? I can kind of go behind their back, right? And I can say, well, I know they're going to produce this quantity at this price. I can produce at a lower price, more quantity, and wipe out the marketplace, right? So it is incentivized almost by colluding to kind of backstab, right? This idea of cartels, backstabbing, it makes it difficult for cartels to honor their agreements. Okay, another thing is called Nash equilibrium, and this is a situation when economic participants interact with one another, each choose the best strategy given the strategy of others chosen. So if you like probability and things like that, Nash equilibrium's right up your alley. All right, so game theory tells us a couple different things about dominant strategy and then also this thing called a prisoner's dilemma. So try and review the prisoner's dilemma situation where we have two folks, right? You put them in separate rooms, and then you tell each of them if you confess and implicate your partner, you go free. If you do not confess, your partner implicates you, you get 20 years in prison. If you both confess, you get 8 years in prison. And so they are trying, right? Confessing is the dominant strategy for both players. It's what they should do. And so, but really ends up they both get 8 years, right? If they would have both stayed quiet, if they would have both remained silent, they both would have had 1 year. So, again, shooting themselves in the foot, the prisoner's dilemma. Examples of prisoner's dilemma as we see out in the world, ad wars, right? Where we see it politically too, where companies spend a ton of money to knock the other one down and then basically and to like build themselves up so they can capture market share. But if they're competing, they basically cancel each other out. So all the extra money on advertising to slam the other one, what happens? It gets canceled out and they basically have the same buyers they did initially, right? So all that money is kind of lost. So it's kind of a waste. The arms race between military superpowers and public policy. So what are some public policies toward oligopolies? Well, as mentioned earlier, if they band together, they can perform like or look like, appear like a monopoly situation. And in this country, we have things called antitrust laws that if companies are banding together or wish to merge or wish to acquire another company within their industry, they basically have to run it by the government. And the government will pore over the documents, see how they're going to merge, see if them merging turns the marketplace into almost a monopoly situation. And if it does, they won't allow the merger, right? So the idea of antitrust laws is if something looks like a monopoly or acts like a monopoly, walks and talks like a monopoly, right? If it's in that situation, then the government will cry foul if you act in a monopolistic way and you violate antitrust. So sometimes you see regulation about that, or you see it invoked issues related to antitrust. And so that is the remainder of the chapters. Please take a look at those. And I know this video is rather long. Oh, 20 minutes. Going on 20 minutes. For next week, I will post your exam. I'm working. Your homework should be updated here, and at the time of this video, it should be pretty updated. And you also should know that the exam is next week. If you're in your paper, so if your paper 2 to 3 pages, using microeconomic terms, elasticity, using one of the marketplaces, try to hit at least like 2 things, right? Talking about equilibrium, consumers, producers, any of that terminology, tie it into your paper. If you've had 101 or other courses where you've looked at a company, now is your chance to look at it through a microeconomic lens and use some of that terminology in your paper, right? So that is due, along with your slides, to me by June 5th. Any remaining homework is due to me by June 5th, but technically homework is due by next Tuesday. And your exam, I will post that next Wednesday. That will be a take-home exam that will be due to me by June 5th as of now. But I will talk about that when I post the exam next week. And I hope you're having a wonderful week and finishing up all of your homework. Again, you can reach out to me, crobertson@ec3pa.org. If you are having any issues, please, we still have a little bit of time. If you have fallen behind, reach out to me, 814-490-6473. You can text me. Reach out to me and hopefully we can make a plan. If you are feeling behind or you're just not sure how you're going to finish out the semester, don't let it go till the end and not turn stuff in, and then you could risk failing. So please reach out to me. I am not mean. Mostly, my kids might say I am, but I will try to make a plan with you moving forward. So have a wonderful afternoon. Have a wonderful Memorial Day, and I will get back at you next week.